Our Torah portion for this evening, as it says at the top of these sheets, Kitisa, Exodus chapter 30 through chapter 34, one of the most consequential of all Torah portions. I hear myself saying that more regularly than not, but this one is among them. This portion contains the story of the golden calf, a blemish on the history of Israel. And God, as you may remember, is extremely miffed. And he decides that he is going to destroy the people and start again with Moses as the new Abraham. But Moses demurs and talks him out of it. And then Moses goes down the mountain and he himself is miffed. But after the golden calf incident in chapters 33 and 34, Moses we see working extremely hard to bring God back into the enterprise. Even though God does not destroy the people, he still feels and is alienated from them. So Moses takes it upon himself to try to mollify God and to point out to God what God's own obligations are. And what you have on this sheet is three passages. A passage from the Torah portion itself, chapter 33. Then we have what seems to be a diversion, because we have Jeremiah chapter 9. And then at the bottom, and you can see in my own hand, it says Maimonides. This is Maimonides' meditation using Jeremiah chapter 9 to understand the meaning of the passage at the top. It's one of the most spectacular interpretations of a Torah portion that I know. You can see in my own hand at the bottom of this page. This is the last paragraph of Maimonides' massive Guide for the Perplexed, and I indicate that it's on page 638. Oftentimes in our poetry group, we remark about how poignant first lines and last lines can be. And a poet who can sock us at the end has really reached our souls. And this is Maimonides' climax to a nearly 650-page exposition of the meaning of Judaism as he tries to reconcile it with Aristotelian philosophy. This may be the last time I mention Aristotle tonight, until I get home. So I'm watching my watch a little bit, because it can be easily, the time can pass. And I want to just point out some of the salient factors here, and I hope you'll take this home if you find yourself stimulated by this topic, and go over them yourselves at a more leisurely pace. So Moses, at the beginning, says here, now, if I have truly gained your favor, he's trying to get back in God's favor, let me know your ways. We have to keep in mind your ways, that I may know you. He, Moses, said, oh, let me behold your presence. And God answered, I will make all my goodness pass before you. God's goodness is to be found in God's ways. And I will proclaim before you the name of the Lord, but you cannot see my face, for no person may see me and live. You want to know my ways? I'm going to show you my ways through my goodness. You ask to see my presence. You ask to see me directly. Nobody can do that. We see God through God's actions and not by an intimacy with God where we can actually see God. And the Lord said, there's a place near me, station yourself on the rock, and as my presence passes by, God's going to be near. I will put you in the cleft of the rock and shield you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take my hand away and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. I've always interpreted my back as the events of history. caused, according to biblical theology, by divine action. We don't see the actor, but we see the consequences of the action, the events, as God moves away. I especially like that interpretation. Okay, let's keep this in mind. Now let's look at the Jeremiah passage. Thus said the Lord, let not the wise man, the chacham, glory in his wisdom. Let not the strong man glory in his strength. Let not the rich man glory in his riches, but only in this should one glory, that he understands and knows me. Now, Maimonides is going to tell us if Jeremiah had stopped there, knowledge would be the highest achievement of human beings. Or, for the ancient Greeks, knowledge is the greatest achievement of human beings, since we are rational animals, and if we bring to realization our reason, then we know as much as we can. But notice, as Maimonides will point out, that Amos goes on. For I, the Lord, act with loving kindness, justice, and righteousness in the earth, for in these I delight, says the Lord. Okay, now let's take a look at what Maimonides has in mind here. The prophet, he's referring now to the Jeremiah passage. By the way, Maimonides is a sage who knows the Torah, the Tanakh, so well that he can find just the right passage in chapter 9 of Jeremiah to elucidate his own thinking. The prophet doesn't content himself with explaining that the knowledge of God is the highest kind of perfection. For if this only had been his intention, he would have said, but in this let him who glorieth glory, that he understands and knows me, the third last line of the Jeremiah passage, and would have stopped there, or he would have said that he understands and knows me, that I am one, or that I have not any likeness, or there is none like me, or a similar phrase. Jeremiah says, however, that man can glory only in the knowledge of God and in the knowledge of his ways and his attributes, which are God's actions, as we have shown, he says, in part 1 of this passage. Okay? Now, what Maimonides is suggesting here is that maybe some of you remember from Philosophy 101, Plato's allegory of the cave, where we're sitting in the cave and we're looking on the shadows that are cast by the light that is shined by the leaders of the community who want us to know certain things. These are the shadows. And if we can manage to get up and turn around and begin to walk up out the cave, we're likely to be able to see the light of the sun, which is the metaphor for knowledge. And according to Plato, the person who is able to do this and sees the fullness of knowledge does not want to go back into the cave. We might say you should go back into the cave because now you have knowledge by which to rule the community. Plato's notion of the philosopher king. And it's the one who knows who should govern. Except the one who has left the cave and been in the presence of the light of knowledge doesn't want to go back in and rule, and has to be forced to do so. Maimonides now is taking on Plato's idea that knowledge is the highest good. Let's go back here. In expounding the passage, show me now your ways. We are thus told in this passage that the divine acts which ought to be known and ought to serve as a guide for our actions are loving kindness, justice, and righteousness. You see back in the Jeremiah passage that after the third to the last line, or that the fourth to the last line, understands and knows me, which Maimonides is saying, were he a Platonist, we would stop there. But the passage goes on. Another very important lesson is taught in the additional phrase, in the earth. Back to the second last line of the Amos passage, justice and righteousness in the earth. For in these do I delight. Back to Maimonides. The prophet, namely Jeremiah, thus in the conclusion says, for in these I delight. My object in saying this is that you shall practice loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness in the earth. In a similar manner, we have shown that the object of the enumeration of God's 13 attributes is the lesson that we should acquire similar attributes and act accordingly. This notion of the imitation of God. We see how God acts, and it's incumbent upon us to act, and that just as God clothes the naked, so should we clothe the naked. Just as God visits the sick, we should visit Abraham after his circumcision. God visits the sick, we should visit the sick. Just as God frees the captives, the Egyptians in Egypt, so should we free the captives. Just as God buries the dead, Moses with a kiss, so should we bury the dead. The imitation of God as the model for us. Back here, the lesson that we should acquire similar attributes and act accordingly. The object of the above passage is therefore to declare that the perfection in which man can truly glory is attained by him when he has acquired, as far as this is possible for a human being, the knowledge of God and the knowledge of God's providence. God's providence refers to how God watches over what happens on the earth and in certain ways guide it, either by giving us the capacities to know and feel, or to give nature its fullness, or from time to time, according to biblical theology, to bring a miracle, to have the sun stop before it sets so that Joshua can continue the battle. We must have some knowledge of God. And in the manner in which, I hope you're following here, I'm in the fourth line from the bottom, in which it influences his creatures in their production and continued existence. Having acquired this knowledge, he will then be determined always to seek loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness, and thus to imitate the ways of God. And we have explained this many times in this treatise. Notice that Maimonides is doing two things here with our Torah portion. He is saying that knowledge is important, to use Plato's image, to try to climb out of the cave where all we see is the shadows cast by others and see the light of the sun and knowledge. But that is not the ultimate good. What we need to do with our knowledge, because after all, go back to the Jeremiah passage, 5 lines from the bottom. But only in this should one glory, that he understands and knows me. For I, the Lord, act with loving kindness, the things that God does, which we must imitate. But Maimonides is suggesting that the Jewish tradition, as exemplified by the Jeremiah passage, is not finely Platonic. It is not that knowledge is the highest good, that the one who comes to know has an obligation to rule and wants to do it. For Plato, once we get knowledge, we don't want to go back into the world of the shadows and mere belief. We have to be forced to go back and lead. For Maimonides, the one who knows recognizes that one has an obligation in the Jewish worldview to use that knowledge in order to the second to the last line in the Jeremiah. Justice, righteousness in the earth. That is, we shouldn't leave the community and know and revel in our knowledge. We have to return to the earth, for this is what delights me, says God. So think of this. For Plato, for Aristotle talks about two kinds of virtues, the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues. The intellectual virtues are higher than the moral virtues. Knowledge over action. For Maimonides, it's the reverse. The ultimate goal of our tradition is to act, to come to understand the meaning of the mitzvot, which Maimonides spends a great deal of time on in the Guide for the Perplexed, in order that we are able to create a better community, a community that is invested in knowing rather than guiding the community by mere belief or by myths. We need to guide the community through the knowledge that we have attained. And so, for Plato and Aristotle, we might say, knowing supersedes doing. What Maimonides is suggesting is that finally, doing supersedes knowing, but notice, knowing is a precondition for doing it correctly. And so Maimonides at the end here arrives at the summit of Judaism, being able to pursue justice, to pursue righteousness, and to pursue loving kindness, for which the curriculum of knowing is crucial, but it's not an end in itself. So you can see that in the hands of a magisterial intellect and leader of the community, how he takes this passage where Moses asked God for his presence. You can't see me. And don't get waylaid. Don't get diverted from what you really should do by trying to know me directly. Let the mystics try that. Our goal is to see how the forces of felicity are intrinsic to our community, to nature. And that by seeing what the Bible calls God's ways, we can then come to imitate God and create the just community. A bit of interpretation of powerful Exodus passage through the prism of Jeremiah chapter 9. If you go back to this passage, you can see why Maimonides looked to this passage, because knowledge here for Jeremiah is not the end of the game.